A little girl's desperate screams echoed through the neighborhood as she begged not to be locked in the basement. The stepmother's cruel intentions were suddenly interrupted when a millionaire appeared at their doorstep, confronting her with unexpected fury. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. 7-year-old Mary Johnson clung to the creaking stair rail, her knuckles white with terror. Each splinter in the worn wood pressed painfully into her small fingers as she desperately tried to anchor herself against her stepmother's relentless pull. Claire Johnson's grip was like iron around Mary's thin wrist, dragging her inexorably toward the basement door that loomed at the bottom of the hallway. "Please, no, I'll be good, I promise." Mary's voice cracked with desperation, her tears leaving glistening trails down her pale cheeks. The old Vermont farmhouse seemed to absorb her cries, the thick walls ensuring no sound escaped to the outside world. Through the dusty windows, the rural landscape stretched empty and indifferent, offering no rescue. Claire's face remained a frozen mask, her lips pressed into a thin line of determination. Not a flicker of emotion crossed her features as she yanked the child forward. "This is for your own good," she stated flatly. "You need to learn consequences for telling stories." The iron key dangled from Claire's other hand, catching the dim afternoon light that filtered through the cloudy windows. Mary's eyes fixed on it with absolute dread, knowing what awaited her in the cold darkness below. The basement had become her personal nightmare, damp, dark, and terrifyingly isolated. "I didn't tell stories, I didn't," Mary sobbed, her small body trembling uncontrollably as they reached the heavy wooden door. The hinges creaked ominously as Claire pushed it open, revealing the pitch-black void beyond the first step. The stepmother's voice dropped to a whisper. "Your drawings are disturbing the teachers. Normal children don't draw such things." She raised the key toward the ancient lock, her movements deliberate and practiced. Just as metal scraped against metal, a commanding voice boomed from the front of the house. "Stop right there!" The unexpected intrusion froze both figures on the stairs. Claire's head snapped up, her composure cracking for the first time. Through the open front door, a tall figure materialized from the misty Vermont afternoon. Paul Smith stood framed in the doorway, his imposing presence filling the space instantly. The reclusive millionaire's sudden appearance was shocking enough. No one in the village had seen him in years, but the authority in his stance was undeniable. His eyes, sharp and assessing, took in the scene in an instant. The terrified child, the basement door, the key. "Let her go, now." His voice left no room for argument, each word landing like stone. Paul took a deliberate step forward, his gaze never leaving Claire's face. "I said, let her go." Claire Johnson spun around, her perfectly composed facade cracking as she faced the unexpected intruder. The iron key dangled from her fingers, momentarily forgotten. Her blue eyes widened with recognition, then narrowed defensively. "Paul Smith," she said, forcing her voice to remain steady. "This is a private family matter." Mary Johnson trembled on the stairs, her small frame still pressed against the wooden rail. Tear tracks glistened on her cheeks as she looked up at the tall figure in the doorway. Something in the stranger's presence made her heart flutter with an unfamiliar feeling. Hope. Paul stood in the threshold, his commanding posture filling the space. "I heard screaming from the road," he said, his gaze never leaving Claire's face. The child was clearly terrified. "My stepdaughter has an overactive imagination," Claire replied, slipping the basement key into her pocket with practiced casualness. "She gets upset over the smallest things. We're working through some behavioral issues." Mary's eyes darted between the adults, sensing the invisible current of tension stretching between them. The 7-year-old hugged herself tightly, afraid to speak, but desperate for this moment not to end. Outside, curtains twitched in neighboring houses. The village had grown accustomed to ignoring the Johnson household's occasional disturbances. For years, they'd pretended not to hear Mary's cries or notice her withdrawn behavior at church gatherings. But Paul Smith's appearance changed everything. The reclusive millionaire hadn't been seen in town for nearly 3 years, and now he stood on Claire Johnson's doorstep, intervening in what everyone had silently agreed was family business. "I'd like to speak with Mary," Paul said, his voice softening as he addressed the child directly. Claire stepped between them. "That's not necessary. As I said, she's just upset over a minor discipline issue." Paul's expression hardened. A locked basement isn't minor discipline. The words hung in the air, heavy with implication. Claire's carefully constructed mask slipped further, revealing a flash of something dangerous beneath. In the houses across the street, Miriam Brown watched through her kitchen window, her aged hands clutching a dish towel. Unlike her neighbors, the elderly woman had tried reporting her concerns about Mary before, only to be dismissed because of an old scandal that had tarnished her reputation in the community. "Why are you here, really?" Claire demanded, recovering her composure. "You've been a hermit for years. Why suddenly care about my stepdaughter?" Paul didn't answer immediately. His eyes found Mary's again, and in that moment, a silent understanding passed between them. The girl sensed it too. This wasn't random. The millionaire had come for a reason, one that somehow connected to her. In the commotion, Mary Johnson's small suitcase tumbled from her grasp, hitting the hardwood floor with a hollow thud. The worn clasp gave way, spilling dozens of drawings across the hallway. Crayon sketches and pencil drawings fanned out like fallen autumn leaves, each page revealing fragments of the little girl's inner world. Paul Smith knelt beside the trembling child, his movements deliberate and gentle. His fingers carefully gathered the scattered artwork, pausing as his eyes caught details that made his breath catch. Dark staircases, a shadowy figure with Claire's distinctive silhouette, a small girl huddled in corners, tears rendered in smudged blue crayon. Most disturbing were the recurring images of a basement door, drawn with heavy, desperate strokes that had sometimes torn through the paper. "These are quite remarkable," Paul said softly, meeting Mary's frightened gaze. The former child psychologist recognized the telltale signs of trauma documentation, art as both testimony and cry for help. Claire Johnson stepped forward, her composure visibly cracking as she snatched several drawings from his hands. "She's always been overly imaginative," she said with a dismissive laugh that didn't reach her eyes. "Children and their fantasies, you know how it is." Mary shrank back against the wall, her small fingers clutching at the wooden banister. She watched the interaction with the wariness of someone accustomed to adult conflicts erupting into something worse. "Actually, I do know," Paul replied, his voice dropping to a tone that commanded attention without raising volume. "I specialized in child psychology for 15 years. He held up one of the drawings, a particularly detailed rendering of the basement door with the iron key prominently featured. "This doesn't look like imagination to me." Claire's face flushed. "I don't appreciate a stranger barging into my home and questioning my parenting methods. And I don't appreciate finding a terrified child about to be locked in a basement." Paul stood to his full height, still holding several of Mary's drawings. "Perhaps you'd like to explain the purpose of that locked door? And why your stepdaughter has drawn it so many times?" The tension in the hallway thickened. Through the front windows, curious neighbors could be seen gathering on the street, drawn by the unusual commotion at the Johnson house. Mary's eyes darted between the adults, then to her scattered drawings. For the first time since Paul's arrival, a flicker of something beyond fear crossed her face. A tentative, fragile hope that someone finally saw what she had been trying to show all along. The tension hung thick in the air as Paul Smith guided Mary Johnson away from the basement door. The little girl's shoulders trembled beneath his gentle grip, her small frame still shaking with sobs that had begun to quiet. Outside on the weathered porch, the autumn wind carried the scent of fallen leaves and distant wood smoke. "You're freezing," Paul murmured, shrugging off his expensive wool jacket and wrapping it around Mary. The garment engulfed her completely, its sleeves dangling well past her fingertips. She clutched at the fabric, burying her face in its warmth. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I made everyone angry." Paul knelt before her, his commanding presence softening as he met her at eye level. His mind flashed back to another child from years ago, a boy whose cries for help he'd dismissed as exaggeration, whose drawings he'd failed to interpret correctly until it was too late. The memory still haunted his dreams. "Listen to me, Mary," he said firmly. "You have nothing to apologize for, nothing." He hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "I promise you won't be alone with this anymore." The little girl's eyes, red-rimmed and wary, studied his face for any sign of deception. She'd heard promises before, from teachers who noticed bruises but accepted Claire's explanations, from neighbors who heard cries but turned away. "Why are you helping me?" she asked, her small fingers tracing patterns on the wooden porch railing. Paul's expression darkened. "Because someone should have helped you long ago." From the doorway, Claire Johnson watched them, her perfectly manicured nails digging into the doorframe. Her carefully arranged smile couldn't quite mask the war of emotions behind her eyes, resentment at the intrusion and fear of what might be revealed. The former child psychologist's sudden appearance threatened everything she'd built in this village. "Mary needs to come inside now," Claire called, her voice honey-sweet but brittle. "It's getting cold. And she has homework." Paul straightened to his full height, turning to face the woman. "We'll be just a moment longer," he replied, his tone leaving no room for argument. Claire's smile tightened. In this small Vermont community, unspoken rules had governed life for generations. Family matters stayed private, appearances were maintained at all costs, and outsiders, even wealthy ones like Paul, didn't interfere. His intervention had just shattered those conventions. As the wind picked up, rustling through the trees surrounding the old house, Mary's small hand slipped into Paul's larger one. The simple gesture of trust made his throat tighten. Behind them, Claire's shadow loomed in the doorway, a silent reminder that this moment of safety was temporary. The battle for Mary Johnson had only just begun. Miriam Brown stood motionless at her kitchen window, age-spotted hands trembling against the faded curtains. Through the glass, she watched Paul Smith guide little Mary Johnson away from that dreadful house, and felt her chest tighten with conflicting emotions. Hope that someone had finally intervened mingled with the bitter dread of knowing what might follow. The elderly woman had lived in this Vermont village long enough to understand its unwritten rules. For 3 years, she'd noticed the changes in Mary, the withdrawal, the flinching at sudden movements, the haunted look in those young eyes. Miriam had tried reporting her concerns, but the village council dismissed her as a busybody with an overactive imagination. "That Brown woman," they'd whisper, "still trying to make herself relevant after that scandal." The scandal, 20 years ago, when she'd accused a prominent council member's son of vandalism, had never truly faded. One mistake, and the community had labeled her unreliable forever. Sighing, Miriam prepared her evening tea, glancing occasionally through the window at the Johnson house. Claire's silhouette paced behind the curtains, agitated and sharp-edged. The neighbor shook her head. That woman had fooled everyone with her polished appearance and charitable committee work, but Miriam had seen through the facade from the beginning. As darkness settled over the village, Miriam wrapped her cardigan tighter and stepped onto her porch to check her mailbox, a nightly ritual from decades of teaching that she couldn't abandon in retirement. Among the usual advertisements sat a folded paper, hastily crammed inside. Back in her warm kitchen, she carefully unfolded the note. No signature, but the handwriting was unmistakable, the same elegant script she'd seen on Claire's community center donation cards. The message was brief but venomous. "Mind your own business. Your interference will only hurt Mary in the end. Some people never learn when to stay silent." Miriam's hands shook, but not from fear. This was the first tangible evidence of Claire's true nature, her first mistake. The elderly woman placed the crumpled letter in a manila envelope, labeled it with today's date, and added it to a box she kept hidden beneath loose floorboards in her bedroom closet. Inside that box lay 3 years of careful observations, dates when Mary appeared with unexplained bruises, notes about the girl's increasingly withdrawn behavior at church functions, and a troubling sketch the child had once left behind during a community center art class. "Now I have proof," Miriam whispered to herself, determination hardening her features. "And this time they'll have to listen." The autumn sun cast long shadows across the village square as the annual harvest festival bustled with activity. Colorful stalls lined the perimeter, the scent of apple cider and cinnamon hanging in the crisp Vermont air. Mary Johnson sat alone on a wooden bench at the edge of the festivities, her small fingers clutching her sketchbook as if it were a shield against the world. The 7-year-old's eyes followed the other children darting between games and treats, their laughter carrying across the square. A group of girls from her class raced past, their faces painted with butterflies and stars. One glanced Mary's way but quickly looked away when their eyes met. Mary hunched her shoulders, opening her sketchbook to a fresh page. Her pencil moved swiftly, capturing the scene before her, not the joyful celebration, but the invisible lines that separated her from everyone else. "That's quite a talent you have there," came a gentle voice. Mary startled, looking up to find Paul Smith standing nearby, his tall figure blocking the afternoon sun. The millionaire's presence had become less shocking to the villagers in recent weeks, though whispers still followed him wherever he went. "May I?" Paul gestured to the empty space beside her. Mary nodded silently, shifting slightly to make room. She didn't close her sketchbook, a small act of trust that wasn't lost on the former psychologist. "I'm starting an art project at the community center next week," he said, watching a group of children bob for apples. "Nothing formal, just a space where young artists can express themselves freely." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "I thought you might be interested." Mary's pencil stilled. "Claire says my drawings are disturbing." Her voice was barely audible above the festival noise. "Your stepmother is entitled to her opinion," Paul replied, his tone measured despite the flash of anger in his eyes. "But art isn't meant to please everyone. It's meant to tell the truth." A faint smile tugged at Mary's lips. She turned to a new page and began sketching again, this time with bolder strokes. "The conservatory has excellent light," Paul continued, "and Oscar Davis has already signed up. I believe you two have met?" Mary nodded, remembering the brash boy who defended her when Claire had made a scene at the school pickup last week. "You don't have to decide now," Paul said, standing. "But the door is always open for you, Mary, no matter what anyone else in this village might say." As he walked away, Mary watched his retreating figure, sensing the weight of his promise. For the first time since that day at the basement door, she felt something unfamiliar stirring inside her. Hope. Claire Johnson paced the kitchen floor, her manicured nails tapping against her smartphone as she formulated her plan. The village had always respected her position as a pillar of the community, and she intended to leverage that respect. Mary's growing connection with Paul Smith threatened everything she had carefully constructed. "I'm concerned about Mary," she whispered to Mrs. Bennett, Mary's teacher, during a parent-teacher conference. Her voice dripped with manufactured concern. "She's been creating these disturbing drawings. The therapist thinks they might be manifestations of her delusions." The teacher's eyes widened. "Delusions? I had no idea." Claire nodded solemnly. "We're doing everything we can at home, but I wanted you to be aware. If she tells stories about being locked up or mistreated, then," she let her voice trail off meaningfully, "well, the doctor says it's part of her condition." Within days, whispers spread through the small Vermont community. At the church bake sale, mothers huddled together, casting sympathetic glances at Claire while keeping their children at a distance from Mary. The stepmother played her role perfectly, the long-suffering caretaker of a troubled child. Mary felt the change immediately. 7-year-old Emma, once her reading partner, suddenly asked to work with someone else. During recess, a circle of children pointed and whispered, their laughter cutting through the playground like shards of glass. "My mom says you make up stories," one boy announced loudly as Mary approached the swings. "She says you're crazy." The little girl's cheeks burned with humiliation. She clutched her sketchbook tighter against her chest and retreated to a quiet corner of the schoolyard beneath an old oak tree. Even her art teacher, who had once praised her work, now examined her drawings with a clinical detachment, searching for signs of mental instability rather than creativity. That evening, alone in her room, Mary opened her sketchbook and began to draw. Her hand moved with newfound intensity, pressing the crayon harder against the paper. The colors she chose were no longer soft pastels, but fierce reds, deep purples, and midnight blues. Where her previous drawings had been tentative, these new creations shouted from the page. She drew the basement door, but this time with a bright light streaming from beneath it. She drew herself, small but standing tall. And in the corner of the page, almost hidden, she sketched the outline of a tall figure, Paul, watching over her. The village might believe Claire's lies, but Mary's truth was becoming stronger with every stroke of her crayon. Her isolation pushed her deeper into her art, transforming her pain into something powerful that no amount of whispered rumors could diminish. Frost clung to the edges of the street lamp as Mary Johnson huddled beneath its flickering light, her small fingers nearly numb as she sketched in her worn notebook. Vermont winters showed no mercy, but the 7-year-old preferred the biting cold to returning home before absolutely necessary. Her breath formed tiny clouds that disappeared into the darkening evening sky. "What you drawing, weirdo?" The voice startled her. Oscar Davis stood there, his untied shoelaces and disheveled hair marking him as the community center's notorious troublemaker. He peered over her shoulder, his curiosity barely masked by feigned disinterest. Mary clutched her sketchbook protectively against her chest. She'd learned that showing her drawings often led to uncomfortable questions, or worse, Claire's punishments. "Hey, I was just asking," Oscar said, his tone softening as he noticed her flinch. "My grandma says I need to work on my approach to conversation." He mimicked an elderly voice, complete with an exaggerated finger wag. Despite herself, Mary smiled slightly. The boy plopped down beside her, seemingly unbothered by the cold concrete. "Everyone thinks I'm bad news," he continued, kicking at a frozen puddle. "Last week, Mrs. Peterson from the church said I was destined for juvenile detention. I just knocked over her stupid flower arrangement by accident." Mary hesitantly loosened her grip on the sketchbook. "People think I make up stories," she whispered. Oscar nodded knowingly. "Adults are weird like that. They want the truth until it's inconvenient." He glanced at her drawings. "Those are actually really good. Way better than my stick figures." For the next hour, they remained beneath the street lamp. Oscar demonstrated his talent for perfectly mimicking the principal's voice and taught Mary how to make a slingshot from rubber bands. In return, she showed him how to blend colors with just her fingertips and how to really see the patterns in tree bark. "You notice everything, don't you?" he asked, genuinely impressed. Mary nodded. "I have to," she replied simply. When they finally parted ways, something had shifted. Oscar promised to meet her again tomorrow, this time with hot chocolate, borrowed from the community center kitchen. Mary agreed, feeling lighter than she had in months. That night, as Claire's footsteps echoed menacingly in the hallway, Mary closed her eyes and thought of Oscar's ridiculous impressions. For the first time, she had found someone who didn't require explanations or proof, just a friend who understood what it meant to be misunderstood. Paul Smith's sudden reappearance in the small Vermont village sent ripples through the tight-knit community. At the Sunday service, parishioners exchanged meaningful glances whenever he entered, their whispers barely contained by the vaulted ceiling. Some residents remembered him as the brilliant child psychologist whose articles had once been featured in prestigious journals. Others recalled only the scandal that drove him into seclusion years ago. "He has no business interfering with the Johnson family," Martha Wilson hissed during the women's literary circle meeting. "Claire has been raising that child just fine without his meddling." "Perhaps," Elaine Thompson countered, setting down her teacup with deliberate care, "but I've seen how that little girl flinches whenever her stepmother raises her voice. Maybe some meddling is long overdue." The village divided itself into factions, those who believed in preserving the status quo versus those who questioned the silence that had allowed suffering to continue unchecked. Paul felt the resistance but remained undeterred. His past failures weighed heavily on his conscience, particularly regarding Mary's mother. This time, he wouldn't back down. Despite the gossip, the Millionaire transformed the community center's conservatory into an art sanctuary. Sunlight streamed through the glass ceiling, illuminating easels arranged in a welcoming circle. Children from across the village gradually trickled in, curious about the tall man with kind eyes who spoke to them as equals. Mary Johnson arrived clutching her sketchbook protectively against her chest. The first session, she sat apart from the others, her small frame tense with anticipation of criticism or punishment. But Paul never forced her participation, instead creating an atmosphere where creativity flowed naturally. By the third week, Oscar Davis had become a regular attendee, his boisterous energy balancing Mary's cautious approach. "You gotta use more red," he insisted, leaning over her canvas. "It makes everything more exciting." For the first time in years, Mary laughed, a genuine sound that startled even herself. The conservatory became filled with color as children expressed themselves freely, their artwork covering the walls in vibrant testimony to their inner worlds. Miriam Brown occasionally observed from the doorway, her weathered face softening at the transformation in Mary. The elderly woman had endured her own village-imposed isolation, but seeing the girl painting in full daylight instead of hiding her work gave her hope that patterns could be broken. "She's flourishing," Miriam remarked quietly to Paul one afternoon. He nodded, watching Mary and Oscar giggling over a particularly ambitious mural. "This is just the beginning," he replied, his voice carrying the weight of a promise. "She deserves to live in the light." Claire Johnson paced her kitchen floor, the heels of her shoes clicking against the tile with increasing urgency. The walls were closing in. That meddling Paul Smith and his art workshops were giving Mary too much confidence, too much voice. Something had to be done before the girl revealed everything. With trembling hands, Claire drafted a letter to Vermont's Department of Children and Families. Her pen scratched viciously across the paper as she fabricated incidents of Mary's dangerous outbursts and disturbing fantasies. The stepmother described how the 7-year-old supposedly threatened other children with scissors during art class, and created drawings that showed deeply concerning violent tendencies. "The child needs professional intervention," Claire wrote, her handwriting growing more erratic with each lie. Her artwork reveals a mind that cannot distinguish reality from fantasy. Not content with this alone, Claire intercepted the mail when the prestigious Young Vermont Artist Scholarship application arrived. Mary had been nominated by her art teacher, who saw remarkable talent in the girl's expressive work. Claire's lips thinned to a hard line as she filled out the parent section herself, attaching a note claiming the submitted pieces showed inappropriate and troubling themes unsuitable for public display. Across the village, Miriam Brown worked with quiet determination. The elderly woman had endured decades of whispers about an old scandal, a love affair with a married doctor that never actually happened. She knew what it meant to be silenced by lies. "They won't ignore this child," Miriam muttered, carefully organizing her evidence in a worn leather portfolio. She had methodically collected copies of Mary's most telling drawings, securing them from the community center when Paul wasn't looking. Each image told a story of isolation and fear, the basement door appearing repeatedly as a dark, looming presence. The neighbor had also gathered statements from others who had witnessed Claire's cold treatment of Mary. Mrs. Peterson from the grocery store had seen Claire grab the girl's arm so hard it left marks. The school bus driver noted how Mary often arrived at the stop with uncombed hair and no lunch on days when Claire was in one of her moods. Most damning of all was what Miriam found hidden in her own attic. A bundle of letters Mary's mother had written to Paul years before her death. Letters that spoke of fear, of plans to leave, of concerns for her daughter's safety if anything happened to her. "This changes everything," Miriam whispered, running her weathered fingers over the faded ink. The village had protected its secrets long enough. It was time for truth to have its day, no matter the cost to reputations or comfortable lies. The bitter Vermont winter had settled over the village like a shroud, bringing with it temperatures that plummeted well below freezing. For Mary Johnson, these frigid days meant more time trapped inside the old house, where Claire's moods grew darker with each passing snowfall. The basement had become a regular punishment, its stone walls holding the cold like a vault. Each time Mary was locked away, she would wrap her small arms around herself, trying to preserve what little warmth remained in her body. The darkness was almost complete, save for thin strips of light that filtered through the narrow window wells near the ceiling. It was during one of these punishments, as she huddled against the wall to avoid the puddles of melted snow, that she noticed something odd about the brickwork. 3 bricks, slightly discolored from the rest, protruded just enough to catch her attention. With trembling fingers, the 7-year-old worked at the loose mortar until one brick shifted. Behind it, tucked into a hollow space, was a rusted tin box with faded flowers painted on its lid. Across the top, in delicate handwriting, was her mother's name. Mary's heart raced as she pried open the box, her small hands shaking not from cold, but from anticipation. Inside lay treasures preserved from time, pressed wildflowers, their colors still vibrant despite the years, a lock of baby hair tied with blue ribbon, photographs of a younger, smiling woman who shared Mary's eyes and gentle expression. But it was the envelope at the bottom that made her breath catch. Addressed simply to Paul, the letter inside was written in the same flowing script as the name on the box. "My dearest Paul," it began, "if you're reading this, I fear the worst has happened. Please find Mary. The basement holds more secrets than just this box. Claire knows everything. That's why she's dangerous." The child ran her fingers over the words, connecting to her mother through ink and paper. There were references to places in the village, to promises made long ago, and warnings about people Mary had never met. Most importantly, there was love. So much love for a daughter the writer clearly knew she might not see grow up. Footsteps overhead startled Mary back to reality. Quickly, she tucked the letter into her sock, replaced the box, and pushed the brick back into position. Claire Johnson might control her present, but Mary now possessed something far more powerful, pieces of her past and possibly a key to her future. As the basement door creaked open, she steeled herself, the secret knowledge warming her from within. Paul Smith needed to see this letter. Somehow, she would make sure he did. The Village Storytelling Festival arrived with the first warm days of spring, a tradition as old as the town itself. Colorful banners fluttered in the breeze as residents gathered in the community center, eager to share tales both fictional and personal. Mary Johnson sat in the back row, her sketchbook clutched tightly against her chest, Oscar Davis fidgeting nervously beside her. When Mrs. Winters, the elementary school principal, took the stage to share what she called an inspiring local story, Mary's stomach tightened. The woman's well-intentioned smile did nothing to soften the blow as she began recounting a sanitized version of Mary's ordeal. A troubled young girl with an overactive imagination found healing through art, Mrs. Winters narrated, her voice syrupy with false compassion. Her kind guardian merely needed to provide structure and discipline to channel the child's emotional difficulties. Mary shrank in her seat as whispers rippled through the audience. The principal continued, transforming Claire's cruelty into concerned parenting and the basement into a quiet reflection space. Paul Smith, seated 3 rows ahead, visibly stiffened as the woman praised the community's respectful privacy in family matters. Oscar's face grew redder with each passing moment. When Mrs. Winters finished to polite applause, the boy suddenly shot to his feet. "That's not what happened!" His voice cracked with emotion, silencing the room. Mary wasn't troubled. She was being hurt. Gasps echoed through the hall as the 7-year-old girl stared up at her friend in shock. Oscar pointed toward Mary's sketchbook. Her drawings show the truth. The basement wasn't for reflection. It was a punishment cell. She drew the darkness, the cold, the fear. Everything her stepmother did to her. Miriam Brown rose shakily from her seat, moving to stand beside Oscar. "The boy is right," the elderly woman announced. "We've all chosen not to see what was happening right before our eyes." The crowd shifted uncomfortably. Some parents covered their children's ears, while others leaned forward, finally willing to hear the unvarnished truth. "I've seen those drawings," a woman from the literary circle admitted quietly. "They're not the work of an overactive imagination." Mary, trembling but emboldened by Oscar's courage, slowly opened her sketchbook. The dark images spoke volumes: the iron key, the shadowed stairs, the small hands reaching up from darkness. As the festival continued in subdued tones, something had fundamentally shifted in the village. The comfortable veil of willful ignorance had been torn, and in its place, the first fragile tendrils of accountability began to take root. Paul Smith stood in the community center's conservatory, carefully arranging the last of the children's artwork on the pristine white walls. Inspired by Oscar's brave defense of Mary at the storytelling festival, the former psychologist had organized an exhibition that would force the village to confront what they had been ignoring. At the center of it all hung Mary Johnson's basement sketches, raw, powerful images that captured both terror and resilience in strokes of charcoal and splashes of watercolor. "These deserve to be seen," Paul whispered to Mary as she helped him adjust the lighting. The 7-year-old nodded silently, her small fingers tracing the edge of her most revealing drawing, a dark staircase with an iron key dangling ominously in the foreground. Word of the exhibition spread quickly through the Vermont village. Residents who had long averted their eyes from the Johnson household now found themselves drawn to the community center, curious about what the reclusive millionaire was planning. Oscar arrived early, proudly pointing out his own colorful contributions while staying protectively close to his friend. When Claire Johnson discovered the exhibition, her carefully maintained composure shattered. She stormed into the village council meeting, her voice trembling with barely controlled rage. "This is exploitation," she declared, slamming her hand on the council table. "Paul Smith is using my stepdaughter's imagination to further his own agenda. Those drawings are private family matters." The council members shifted uncomfortably in their seats. For years, they had accepted Claire's explanations about Mary's difficult behavior and overactive imagination. But public sentiment was changing. Miriam Brown sat quietly in the back row, her weathered hands folded in her lap, watching as the council president cleared his throat. "The community center is a public space, Mrs. Johnson," he stated firmly, "and there's been considerable support for this exhibition from parents and children alike." Claire's attempts to shut down the show only intensified interest. By opening night, the conservatory was packed with villagers, their expressions shifting from curiosity to shock as they moved from drawing to drawing. Mary's artwork revealed a narrative impossible to dismiss: the locked basement, the long hours of isolation, the fear that permeated her young life. "I had no idea," whispered a teacher, who had once dismissed Mary's withdrawn behavior as shyness. Paul stood beside Mary throughout the evening, his hand gently resting on her shoulder as she faced the community's awakening. For the first time, the girl's truth was visible to everyone, impossible to ignore or explain away. Claire arrived late, hovering at the entrance, watching as her carefully constructed facade crumbled under the weight of Mary's artistic testimony. The stepmother's lies, maintained for years through intimidation and the village's willful blindness, were finally exposed to the harsh light of day. Miriam Brown stood in the center of the village council meeting, her weathered hands trembling as she revealed the yellowed letters she'd kept hidden for decades. The community center's main hall fell silent as she read aloud the words of Mary's mother, passionate pleas to Paul Smith about protecting her daughter should anything happen to her. She knew, Miriam said, her voice gaining strength. She knew Claire would never love Mary as her own. The revelation rippled through the room like a stone dropped in still water. The elderly woman, who had been dismissed for years as a busybody, was now the keeper of the village's most explosive secret. The letters detailed a promise Paul had made to Mary's mother, a vow to watch over her child that he had failed to honor until now. Paul sat in the back row, his tall frame hunched forward, each word striking him like physical blows. The memories flooded back, the engagement ring he'd given Mary's mother, their plans for a future together, and the bitter argument that had torn them apart. He had left the village afterward, his pride wounded, never knowing she was pregnant with Mary. "Is it true?" asked the council chairwoman, her eyes fixed on Paul. "Were you engaged to her?" Paul nodded slowly. 20 years ago, we loved each other, but I was ambitious, focused on my career as a child psychologist. When she wanted to stay in Vermont, I chose New York instead." His voice cracked. "I never knew about Mary until I returned and saw her drawings. They were so like her mother's." Outside the meeting hall, rumors spread through the village like wildfire. At the local diner, residents debated whether Claire Johnson had any legal right to Mary at all. Some questioned if she had manipulated the girl's father before his death, while others wondered if Paul's return was motivated by guilt or genuine concern. Claire, cornered by these revelations, began calling her attorney frantically from her vehicle parked behind the church. Her carefully constructed life was unraveling thread by thread. That evening, Paul walked alone by the river where he had once proposed. He picked up a smooth stone, turning it over in his palm as he confronted the weight of his past choices. The millionaire who had built his fortune helping troubled children had failed the one who should have mattered most. "I won't make the same mistake twice," he whispered to the rushing water. As darkness fell, Paul made a new vow, not just to protect Mary, but to help her heal, to give her the childhood she deserved, and to face whatever consequences came from bringing the truth to light. In his pocket, he carried one of Mary's recent drawings, a small figure emerging from darkness into light, a testament to her resilience and a reminder of all that remained to be done. Mary Johnson's haunting basement sketches had transformed from private nightmares into public testimony. The Vermont Chronicle ran a front-page story featuring her artwork, complete with photographs that captured the raw emotion behind each brushstroke. Outsiders began trickling into the quiet village, journalists with probing questions and art enthusiasts who recognized genuine talent born from genuine pain. "The child's work speaks volumes about resilience," noted one critic, whose praise brought unwanted scrutiny to the village council. Suddenly, officials who had looked the other way found themselves facing uncomfortable questions about Claire Johnson's guardianship. The council president, under mounting pressure, ordered a formal investigation. What they discovered sent shockwaves through the community. Claire had never completed the legal adoption process after Mary's mother died. The paperwork remained unfinished, deliberately abandoned in bureaucratic limbo. "She has no legal right to that child," Miriam Brown declared at the emergency town meeting, her voice steady despite Claire's icy glare from across the room. The elderly woman stood tall, vindicated after years of being dismissed as a busybody. "I've been saying something wasn't right in that house for years." Paul Smith provided financial resources for a proper investigation, hiring specialists who uncovered the truth with methodical precision. "Mary deserves protection under the law," he insisted, his commanding presence filling the town hall. "And Claire must answer for what she's done." The village that had once valued privacy above protection now rallied around the small, vulnerable girl. Neighbors brought home-cooked meals to Paul's house where Mary was staying temporarily. Teachers collected her schoolwork and delivered encouraging notes from classmates. Even Oscar Davis and his grandmother arrived with handmade cards and cookies. "You're not alone anymore," Oscar told her, his usually mischievous face serious as he squeezed her hand. Claire, sensing her control slipping away, made one desperate move. She arrived at Paul's home while he was meeting with social services, claiming she needed to collect Mary's belongings. Instead, she grabbed the child and dragged her toward a waiting car. "Help!" Mary screamed, her voice carrying across the manicured lawn. Mrs. Henderson, tending her garden next door, heard the commotion and immediately called the police. The retired schoolteacher then grabbed her walking stick and hobbled toward the struggle, her arthritis forgotten in the moment. "You let go of that child right now," she demanded, positioning herself between Claire and the vehicle. Police arrived within minutes, finding Claire still clutching Mary's arm, her perfectly maintained facade finally crumbling completely. As officers led her away, the stepmother's desperate pleas about family matters fell on deaf ears. The community had finally chosen truth over appearances, protection over privacy. Mary watched from Paul's protective embrace, her small body trembling but her eyes clear and focused. For the first time, she wasn't the one being taken away. The courtroom fell silent as the judge granted Paul Smith temporary custody of Mary Johnson. The reclusive millionaire stood solemnly beside his attorney, his eyes fixed on the small figure clutching Miriam Brown's weathered hand. This was only the beginning of a long legal battle, but it was a crucial first victory. The drive to Paul's estate on the outskirts of the Vermont village was quiet. Mary pressed her forehead against the car window, watching familiar streets fade into winding country roads. The vehicle climbed a gentle hill, revealing a sprawling house nestled among ancient maple trees. Nothing like the dark, cramped home she'd shared with Claire. "It might take some time to feel comfortable here," Paul said softly as he carried her small suitcase up the stone pathway. "But this is your space now, to make your own." Inside, sunlight streamed through tall windows, illuminating rooms that seemed impossibly large to Mary. She moved cautiously, as if afraid her presence might somehow break the peaceful stillness. A bedroom had been prepared for her, walls painted a gentle blue, shelves waiting for her books and drawings. That night, Mary woke screaming, convinced she was locked in darkness. Paul rushed to her side, his voice steady as he oriented her. "You're safe. The door is open. No one will lock you in." The village gossip machine worked overtime. Former colleagues questioned Paul's motives, suggesting his interest in Mary was merely atonement for past failures. "He abandoned her mother years ago," whispered Elaine Porter at the Women's Literary Circle. "Now he's playing savior." Paul weathered these storms with quiet dignity, though Mary noticed how his shoulders tensed when they ventured into the village for groceries. The psychologist who had once commanded respect now faced suspicious glances and hushed conversations. Mary struggled with her own demons. She hoarded food in her dresser drawers, afraid it might be taken away. She flinched at sudden movements, apologized excessively, and asked permission before using the bathroom. Years of Claire's control had left invisible chains that wouldn't easily break. Yet healing began in small moments. One evening, while exploring a storage room, Mary discovered a box of her mother's belongings, a bottle of perfume that released a forgotten scent, triggering tears and then, unexpectedly, comfort. Miriam visited often, bringing homemade cookies and stories. The elderly woman would sit beside Mary's bed, reading tales of brave children and gentle adventures, her fingers softly brushing through the girl's hair until sleep came. "She needs routine and patience," Miriam advised Paul, one evening as they shared tea in the kitchen. "And so do you." Together, they created a new kind of family, unconventional but fiercely protective, bound not by blood but by a shared commitment to truth and healing. Oscar Davis returned to school with his head held high. After being expelled for his outburst at the storytelling festival, the truth about Mary Johnson's situation had finally come to light, forcing the school administration to acknowledge their mistake. The children who had once mocked him now regarded him with a mixture of awe and respect. "You're like a hero now," Mary told him one afternoon as they sat on the steps of Paul Smith's home, sharing a packet of cookies. Oscar shrugged, uncomfortable with the attention. "I just said what everyone should have been saying all along." The following weekend, Oscar brought Mary to meet his grandmother, Eleanor Davis. The elderly woman welcomed them into her modest cottage, filled with the scent of herbal tea and old books. As the retired village midwife, Eleanor had delivered most of the local children over 4 decades, including Mary herself. "I remember the night you came into this world," Eleanor told Mary, her weathered hands gently opening a leather-bound journal. "Your mother was so brave." Mary leaned forward, her heart racing. "You knew my mother?" The old woman nodded, adjusting her reading glasses. "I delivered nearly every baby in this village for 40 years. I keep records of them all." Eleanor shared entries from her midwife journals, revealing details about Mary's birth that had been kept from her. The pages contained not just clinical notes, but personal observations, her mother's determination, her first words upon holding Mary, and most importantly, her final wishes should anything happen to her. "She never wanted Claire to raise you," Eleanor said softly. "She had asked Paul to be your guardian if anything happened to her." Mary's fingers trembled as she turned pages, filled with her mother's hopes and fears. "This is why Claire kept me away from everyone. She was afraid someone would remember." That evening, Mary returned to Paul's house and spread her drawings across the living room floor. With new understanding, she began to see connections she'd missed before. The basement sketches weren't just expressions of fear. They contained clues her subconscious had been trying to communicate. "Look," she pointed to recurring symbols in her artwork, a specific window pattern, a distinctive tree visible only from certain angles of the property. "I think my mother hid something else." Paul knelt beside her, studying the drawings with newfound clarity. "These aren't just memories, Mary. They're maps." Over the next few days, Mary and Oscar became detectives of her past. Each sketch they analyzed revealed another fragment of truth. Oscar's natural curiosity complemented Mary's artistic insight, and together they began assembling the puzzle pieces of her history. "Your mom was trying to protect you," Oscar said, helping Mary arrange her drawings in chronological order. "And now she's still helping you find your way home." The women's literary circle of the Vermont village had long been a gathering place where whispered rumors spread like wildfire. For decades, their Tuesday meetings at the church basement had been more about exchanging gossip than discussing literature. But something remarkable was happening within those wood-paneled walls. Miriam Brown stood before the group, her weathered hands steady as she proposed transforming their meetings into story nights for children. "Every child deserves to be heard," she said, her voice carrying the weight of someone who had been silenced herself. The room fell quiet, uncomfortable with this disruption to their routine. Mary Johnson sat beside her, small fingers clutching her sketchbook. The 7-year-old had grown bolder since moving into Paul Smith's home, her eyes no longer constantly searching for escape routes. When she spoke up to support Miriam's idea, Several women exchanged glances, remembering how they had once dismissed her as Claire's troubled stepdaughter. "I think kids have important things to say," Mary said softly. "Sometimes grown-ups forget to listen." The simplicity of her words cut through years of pretense. Mrs. Winters, the circle's president, cleared her throat and called for a vote. To everyone's surprise, the proposal passed. The first story night drew 12 children, including Oscar Davis, who arrived with his grandmother. The retired midwife nodded encouragingly as her grandson shared a tale about a boy who could see things others pretended not to notice. Mary recognized it as their story, hers and Oscar's, thinly disguised as fiction. Within weeks, the story nights became the talk of the village. Children revealed their fears, hopes, and observations through stories and artwork displayed on the church walls. Parents listened, sometimes uncomfortably, as truths emerged through metaphor and fantasy. Then, the anonymous notes began appearing on the village notice board. The first simply read, "We knew about the Johnson basement. We did nothing." The next day, "We heard Miriam Brown's warnings years ago. We silenced her." Each morning brought new confessions, typed on plain paper, admissions of times when the village had chosen comfort over courage. No one knew who was posting them, though some suspected Paul Smith or perhaps one of the literary circle members. These public acknowledgments of collective failure sparked heated debates at the general store and restaurant. Some villagers tore down the notes in anger. Others stood guard to ensure they remained visible. "It's like lancing a wound," Miriam told Mary as they walked past the notice board one evening. "Painful, but necessary for healing." Mary nodded, understanding more than most adults realized. The village was changing, not in grand dramatic ways, but in small, significant shifts of consciousness. People were beginning to look each other in the eye again, to speak uncomfortable truths, to listen. It wasn't perfect. Change rarely is. But for the first time in decades, there was hope. Summer arrived with golden warmth that seemed to wash away the shadows of winter. Mary Johnson stood on a wooden ladder in the library, her small hands steady as she added the final brushstrokes to her mural. What had begun as private sketches hidden in the darkness of Claire's basement had transformed into a vibrant public testament spanning the entire wall. The 7-year-old had worked for weeks, guided by Paul Smith's gentle encouragement and Miriam Brown's unwavering support. Her artwork depicted not just the pain of her past, but the journey toward healing. Dark corners giving way to bursts of light, locked doors standing open, and small figures reaching toward one another across impossible distances. "It tells a story without words," whispered Oscar Davis to his grandmother as they watched Mary work. The boy who had once been her only friend now stood proudly among many who had come to admire her courage. The entire village gathered for the mural's unveiling. Some faces showed awe at the child's raw talent. Others reflected shame for their years of silence. The women's literary circle members dabbed at tears, while the village council members shifted uncomfortably, remembering their initial reluctance to believe. Meanwhile, Claire Johnson faced the consequences of her actions in a courtroom 2 towns over. The evidence Miriam had collected, combined with Mary's testimony and the discovery of the basement's conditions, had resulted in criminal charges. The stepmother who had wielded fear as a weapon now found herself stripped of both Mary's guardianship and her carefully constructed reputation. Paul stood at the back of the crowd, his tall figure easy to spot but his expression unreadable. The former psychologist had risked everything to protect this child, his privacy, his peace, even friendships dating back decades. Yet watching Mary confidently present her work, he knew every sacrifice had been worthwhile. "I wanted to show what happened," Mary explained in her small voice that somehow carried through the hushed library, "but also what happens after." She pointed to the brightest corner of the mural, where a tiny figure stood in sunlight, surrounded by protective shadows that looked remarkably like the silhouettes of Paul, Miriam and Oscar. As the little girl stepped back to view her creation in its entirety, she understood something profound. The scars of her past would never completely vanish. They had become part of her story. But alongside them grew something stronger: resilience, friendship, and the power of her own voice. That evening, as fireflies danced outside the library windows, Mary's hand found Miriam's wrinkled one. "The basement isn't scary anymore," she said simply. "Not when I can paint it out here where everyone can see." Paul Smith stood on the porch of his once isolated home, watching Mary Johnson chase fireflies with Oscar Davis across the lawn. The evening light caught in her hair as she laughed, a sound that had once been so rare but now filled these summer evenings. The millionaire had sacrificed his carefully constructed solitude and lost several long-standing friendships in the village. Those who had preferred silence over justice couldn't forgive his disruption of their comfortable denial. But what he'd gained far outweighed what he'd lost. The former psychologist glanced at the family photo now framed on his wall. Himself, Mary, and Miriam Brown gathered around a birthday cake, their smiles genuine. This unlikely family, forged through shared trauma and healing, had given him purpose beyond redemption. "She's thriving," Miriam said, joining him on the porch with 2 steaming mugs of tea. The elderly woman had become a fixture in their lives, her wisdom and steadfast support a foundation for Mary's recovery. The village council had formally apologized to Miriam last week, acknowledging decades of ostracism based on rumors and gossip. They'd even named the new community garden after her, a small gesture that nonetheless brought tears to her eyes. Her vindication had come late in life, but it had come. Inside the house, Mary's artwork lined the hallways, no longer hidden in sketchbooks, but proudly displayed. Her most recent pieces showed less darkness, more light. The therapist who visited twice weekly noted significant progress in her emotional healing, though nightmares of the basement still occasionally haunted her sleep. Claire Johnson awaited trial in a county courthouse, her carefully constructed facade finally shattered. The evidence Miriam had collected, combined with Mary's testimony and the letters from her mother, had built an irrefutable case against her. The legal proceedings would be difficult, but Mary had insisted on telling her story. "So other kids won't have to be scared," she'd explained with determination beyond her 7 years. The village itself was changing. Neighbors who had once looked away now checked on each other's children. The Willans Literary Circle had transformed into an advocacy group for family welfare. Even Oscar's grandmother had started a support program for children in difficult home situations, sharing her wisdom with a community finally ready to listen. As twilight deepened, Mary ran back to the porch, breathless with excitement, clutching a jar with one perfect, glowing firefly. "Look what I caught!" she exclaimed, her face illuminated by its gentle light. Paul smiled, remembering the terrified child who had once clung to a staircase. Now she stood in the light, her voice heard, her art seen, her story honored. The village had learned its hardest lesson. True healing comes not from silence, but from protecting those who cannot protect themselves.